All right. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a fan of your work too, Denise. I'm really glad that we're friends and we've stayed in touch over the years. It's been a real privilege getting to know you, and I'm honored to be here with the New Orleans group. Um, I wanted to go down there and talk in person. I just couldn't make it work. My son has driver's ed, and we had stuff that I couldn't quite make it work. But someday I will get to New Orleans because I've heard it's a great city. So a little bit about myself. I've done a lot of things in my life. I used to be a musician, actually. I was a composer and performer and music teacher in schools as well as privately for many years. I worked at a recording studio for a while, had lots of different types of work. I ended up moving into web design and working for universities, building online courses. Um, I've lived a lot of places. Right now, I'm currently living in Des Moines, Iowa, not nearly as cool as New Orleans. I'm sorry, but this is where I am. um, I like to try to pretend that I'm a normal person just living my life sometimes, but all this time, over the years, I've been secretly studying astrology behind the scenes, learning about the heavens and the magical connections to our lives. And I have known from the first moment that I heard about astrology and learned about it, I'm called to do this. I know I'm supposed to do this. And life goes on. You gotta make a living, and you can't just jump into it. But I've been studying over the years because I know that eventually the door is going to open. I've also secretly been studying natural health and plants and the power of Mother Earth to heal our bodies. And I might look normal on the outside, but you get to know me and I'm pretty weird, and that's okay. um, I love it. I love astrology. I love herbalism, and I love serving. I feel like it's kind of like a priestess role, connecting heaven and earth and bringing it to people's lives in practical, helpful ways, hopefully. So as Denise said, we met at the School of Traditional Astrology. We both have certifications from that school. I have a, we both have a certification in horary astrology. I went on to get the medical astrology certification as well. I don't remember if you did that as well, Denise. But I also have my certification in family herbalism with the Commonwealth School of Holistic Herbalism, and then a few other really narrow focused herbalism certificates from other various places. Probably most importantly, I'm a mama of two wonderful kids. They are the light of my life. They inspire me. They keep me going. They keep me honest. And that's enough about me. Let's talk about the topic of the day. All right, so I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the field of medical astrology. And this is a tricky area to cover because we're talking about health. That also necessarily means we have to think about when we don't have health, when there are diseases or problems, issues with the body. And I want to be careful because I don't want to scare anyone, and I don't want to cause a self-fulfilling prophecy, where you kind of like, oh, this is in my chart, and then you kind of think about it so much that you kind of like create it. I don't want to, you have to be careful with that kind of stuff. I believe in empowering people and encouraging people and offering hope and not doom. Now, life does have problems. We have to be realistic about that. But I believe that the value of astrology is in helping us solve our problems or prevent problems if possible. So the approach I like to take is something I'm calling strategic wellness. And I'll discuss what I mean by that in a minute. I'm going to explain how to find the sixth house in your astrological chart. I'll briefly cover what it means traditionally. I'll talk about the planets in the astrology, what they rule in health, and some suggestions for working with these energies. Now, since I am an herbalist, I really wanted to bring in the plants as well, because there's actually a long tradition of the planets in the sky ruling certain plants on the earth, and herbal friends that can relate to the planet's energies. The only thing is that when I first created this presentation and I practiced and I went through and I said everything I wanted to say, it took like all day. So I had to cut some things out. So what I decided to do is just briefly mention one herb for each planet real quickly. It'll be kind of a teaser. There are more herbs. There's millions of herbs out there. There are it's a wonderful field. So if you're curious, you can look into it more in depth on your own, but I just had to at least talk about it, the plants a little bit. So, and then of course there will be time for questions. And you can just kind of interrupt me at any point where there's kind of a natural pause, Denise, and like tell me if there's something in the chat. Is that probably a good way to do it?
Yeah, that's fine. So far all that's there is Caleb said that Des Moines is his dad's hometown.
Oh, great. I just moved here a year ago, so I'm still getting to know it. So people are really nice here. It's a little unsettling. I'm like, why are you being so nice to me? Like, what's your alternative? No, they're just nice. It's the Midwest. So it's cool. All right. So what is medical astrology? Now, it's important to say up front, I am not a medical provider. I cannot legally make certain claims that would give anyone the impression that I am. And honestly, I don't even want to be confused with a medical provider. That's not what I do. I can't diagnose. I can't treat a disease. I can't prescribe, nothing like that. That's not my lane. The problem is that the term medical astrology was invented before they wrote the law about you can't say you're medical. So we have this pre-existing term medical astrology that is kind of problematic in today's environment. And I'm not mad about that law, honestly. It's a good law because it protects people. People have gotten seriously hurt by unethical practitioners in the alternative field. Just to give you an example, a couple years ago in Des Moines, where I lived, there was a medical psychic who told a man he had cancer and it had spread throughout his entire body. So he went to the doctor and he got a full workup, all the blood work. He didn't have any symptoms. And all the tests came back negative. You don't have cancer. Don't worry about it. So he went back to the psychic and she insisted, no, the doctors are wrong. I'm right. You have cancer. It's spread throughout your entire body. The guy got so scared, he actually committed suicide because he didn't want to go through the suffering of dealing with cancer. So the family sued that psychic for practicing medicine without a license, as they should, because what she said was wildly unethical and irresponsible. And that is not how we use astrology. And it's not an ethical way to work with astrology at all, or any alternative field. So I think it's probably better to say something like health astrology or wellness astrology, something like that, because it's really more the focus. It's the focus on the physical body and how it correlates to the signs in the heavens. I see astrology as a spiritual calling. It is about energy, is about empowering people. It's not about science and getting down to the chemical nature of everything. And it's not like that. Astrology uses a symbolic language. And symbols can mean a lot of things. It's very, you have to kind of take it for what it is, in the sense that it's symbolic and it's, connecting to abstract ideas. And I'll talk more about that later. But just to be very clear and upfront, we're not talking about diagnosing diseases here, okay? All right, so the field of medical astrology goes back at least 2,000 years, probably longer than that. And I just included this image. It's an anatomy book from the medieval period, and I thought it was hilarious and wonderful. So I wanted to put it on the slide. I regularly, in studying medical astrology, I consult with texts that were written centuries ago, all the way back like 2 centuries before BCE. And, so we have herbalists that, like, Hippocrates is like, I think 3rd century BCE, Galen, Avicenna, like these are all herbalists that were working in this field, and there's a long tradition. And then on the astrological side, Ptolemy is all the way back to the 2nd century, maybe 1st century, and then I'd have to look, I think it's 2nd century. These are a bunch of astrologers who practice medical astrology. And it's a tradition that's being passed along. I think it's important to recognize that astrology is a very old tradition. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. I'm not just making things up. I'm not just coming here today like, well, I think that this planet means that. No, there's a long tradition, which is really exciting and interesting and valuable, I think, to look at the past. Now, of course, when all of these texts are being written, medical understanding was very different from what we have today. The theories about how things worked were quite different. One of the main differences was the theory of humors. They believed there were 4 humors. We would kind of think of them as like fundamental elements or building blocks that comprise the entire body. So they believe there was yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm, and the mixture of these created all of the parts of our body. As far as we know, the theory of humors evolved separately from astrology, and then at some point the astrologers kind of put the astrology onto the pre-existing theory. It's hard to tell when you're going that far back in time because we don't have all of the texts, but that's kind of what we think now. Astrologers eventually correlated the 4 humors with the 4 elements: fire, earth, air, and water, which you're probably familiar with. Now, nowadays, of course, we know the body has a lot more literal elements in it than that, but the four elements theory is still helpful. And bear with me because I know this sounds weird to modern ears, but this is kind of the approach that that they would take. So yellow bile is one of the humors, and astrologers relate it to the element of fire because it's hot and dry and fast moving. Black bile, they relate it to earth, and it's cold and dry, slow. Blood, they related to air, which is hot and wet. And then water, they related to phlegm, which is cold and wet. Now, the reason that this is it can still be helpful as a kind of rule of thumb or just a sort of framework to come from is in herbalism, we have herbs that either reinforce or go against these qualities. So for example, if someone is presenting with fiery symptoms like inflammation, right, it's hot and it's dry like a rash or something, we can choose herbs that have cooling energy that reduce the inflammation. Or for example, in the old days, they might say a patient had too much black bile in the system, right? That correlates with the earth element. Earth is cold and dry and hard. And a patient today could still have symptoms that feel like too much earth. Things are cold, they're dry, they're sluggish, they're not moving, there's blockages. Maybe it's like constipation or something like that. And so that's how the patient feels, even though we're not talking about literal substances. And those feelings can be helpful in figuring out what's going on. And then we have a whole array of plants to choose from, or even lifestyle suggestions to choose from that can be helpful for warming up the body if it's cold, or getting things moving if it's sluggish, or loosening blockages, stuff like that. So these ideas are more about patient experience, even if the chemical constituents are not literally correct, right? So you kind of have to step back. And remember, this is a tradition. A tradition is meant to be alive. We don't stay stuck in the understandings of the past, but we do honor it. We value it and we build on tradition, keeping the good, kind of, throwing away the bad, and we advance our knowledge with respect and responsibility. Another difference with traditional approaches to health is that, at least on the astrological side of things, they thought in terms of systems of the body. So physical illnesses or organs were not these discrete things that were on their own working by themselves. They saw that energetically everything is connected as a network. And so in medical astrology, each planet represents a system of the body that might not be literal, but it's energetically connected. And it's represented by the symbol of that planet. So let's say we have Jupiter that is symbolizing the illness. Now, Jupiter represents the liver, but it's not just the liver, like the organ itself by itself. It's the liver system. It's the purity of your blood, the ability to detoxify impurities from your body. And it also affects your spiritual health and your mental health. It's all considered as kind of like Jupiter's realm or Jupiter's area, right? So scope of medical astrology is more broad, and they think kind of holistically. As far as how I practice, obviously everyone's choices are different in how they practice. My services as a health astrologer, one reading that I offer is if you have like a specific issue, we can do a horary chart for it. So maybe you have something going on in your body, you can't figure out what's wrong. We can pull an astrological chart and get important clues about where to look we can figure out what to do next. Now, again, I cannot diagnose, and I don't want to diagnose because that is not what we're looking for. The kinds of things a chart can tell us are like, for example, how serious the illness? Is this something that, get thee to a specialist tomorrow? Or is it something that, with normal care, it'll pass? Like we can kind of gauge that based on the chart. The chart can also tell us whether this issue is caused by psychological factors or physical factors or both. And then it can also tell us what systems in the body that we need to investigate and support. And again, remembering that the systemic thinking is broader and more networked in its application than what we think of in conventional medicine. So another reading I offer is called medical election. If you need to have some kind of procedure like a surgery or whatever, and you're nervous about it, I can look at your astrological birth chart, as well as the upcoming transits and the time slots you have to choose from, and help you pick an optimal time for the procedure. I also offer temperament reports, which are written reports that you can keep and refer back to, where I analyze your astrological birth chart and give ideas for lifestyle, nutrition, exercises, things that are going to resonate with your energy and how you were made to make your body happy. And then the bulk of my work is actually going to be health coaching. And this is really fun because I get to know my clients more deeply because we meet on a regular basis. Clients usually have some kind of a specific health goal, whether it's reduce pain or have more energy or whatever their goal is. And I can offer education about traditional approaches. I can offer education about holistic suggestions for natural health, informed by modern scientific sensibilities. And then really the most value of health coaching is in the accountability and the encouragement as you're working towards your goal. So yeah, my website is seebystarlight.com if you want to check it out. Okay, what is strategic wellness? So I kind of have been hinting at this all along. Let's think about building a house. Let's say you have some land and you want to build a house on it. So the first thing you need to do is figure out what the features of the land are, because that's going to affect your choices. Is there a hill? Is the soil rocky or swampy? Is there a pond? These are all features of the landscape you need to work with. And then, of course, there's climate. Y'all are in New Orleans, right? Which I hear is pretty humid. Denise was telling me about how humid it gets. So the architecture there, you got to do extra weatherproofing to avoid mold, right? Whereas when I used to live in Phoenix, Arizona, we didn't have that problem. We had other problems, but not so much the humidity. And then here in Des Moines, of course, we have to worry about snow in the winter. And so, for all of these places, you have to know the pros and cons of where you are. And you want to maximize the positives and strengthen against any downsides. And it's the same with our health. We need to know what we're working with. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. Some people are just prone to certain conditions, just, it's their genetics, their environment, whatever. As an example, I know somebody who is really prone to ear infections. Turns out she's got really narrow tubes, and something about the way her skull is shaped, it just makes it easier for bacteria to settle there. So she has to be super careful about her ears and always kind of be careful. Whereas I couldn't tell you the last time I had an ear infection. I don't get ear infections really, but my body is prone to other issues. I get a lot of hormonal issues. So I always have to keep, checking my hormones, making sure that I'm staying in balance there. And everyone has something like that. It's just life. Every body has its own, terrain. And astrology can help us learn about that. What systems or organs in our bodies are weaker or stronger, and we can proactively work to strengthen the areas that might be more vulnerable. Now, of course, there's a lot that goes into it. It would not only be incorrect, but also unethical to say you're going to get a disease in this system. That is not how this works. Astrology gives us clues about propensity and possibility, but you got to know your environment and understand that everything's connected and it's not guaranteed, right? So you can be smart about the choices you make. If you know, I might be prone to this thing, I'm just not going to do XYZ because that's going to be too much of a risk. Whereas I can probably take more risks in this other area. It's less likely, right? So that's what I mean about strategic wellness. It's being strategic about our health, not fearful. Okay, so I wasn't sure how advanced or beginner the people coming to this meeting are going to be. So this next part, I'm going to just talk about some basics of a chart, an astrological chart. If you already know this, just bear with us. I'm just going to explain what it means, what the sixth house means. So to find the houses in your chart, you need to know your birth date, your time, the time of birth, and location. So you enter that into an astrology software of some kind, and you'll end up with an astrology chart that might look something like this. This is just an example chart I created. This is not a real person. I took all the planets out of it, just so you can see kind of the structure of what the chart looks like. So I'm going to turn on my pen here. So you see on the edge, we've got the signs. I'm just going to kind of, these are the signs. This is the signs of the zodiac. You're probably familiar with how they look. And then in the middle, we have, it's kind of a wheel with spokes, and each one has a number. So it's conveniently numbered 1 through 12. And these are the houses: first house, second house, third house, fourth house, and so on. Let me get rid of my pen. Okay, so the sixth house would be this wedge of the pie here with a 6 on it. And traditionally, one of the names of the sixth house is the house of illness. Now, again, try to ignore the scary language. This just means in our strategic wellness frame, the areas where we need, that might be weaker and that we need to defend to kind of, to prevent issues from arising. So what do we need to look at? The first thing that we look at is the sign on the cusp of the house, okay? So each of these lines is called a cusp, and it goes in counterclockwise order. So this is the cusp of the first. This is, I can turn the pen on if that would be easier. Let me do that again. Okay, so this would be the cusp of the first. This would be the cusp of the second, and so on. So the cusp of the sixth is this line right here. It's going to point to a sign. And so in this chart, we have the sixth house, the cusp is Gemini, all right? So that's the first thing we look at, is what sign are we, what sign are we working with here? And then we're going to look at the ruler of that sign. So the ruler of Gemini is Mercury. So we find where Mercury is in the chart. So just as an example, let's say this person has Mercury up here. So we're looking at the sign and we're looking at the ruler. And then if that house has a planet in it, you're going to look at planets placed in the house. So for example, this person has Mars placed in the sixth house. So Mars is going to be part of their sixth house story. There are other things we can look at. We can get really deep in the weeds, but this is more than enough to get started. So if you find the sign on the cusp, find its ruler, and then look and see if you have any planets in the house. You may or may not. You don't always have planets in the sixth, but if you do, that's going to be part of your sixth house story. Now, if that's too much, just focus on number 2 here, the ruler of the sign, because that is going to ultimately be the boss of what happens in the sixth house. So if you strengthen that planet, it's going to have downstream effects on all the other ones. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, don't worry. We can just focus on one planet at a time. That's totally fine. Okay, and then in case you don't know the rulers, these are the rulers. So Aries is ruled by Mars, Taurus is ruled by Venus, Gemini by Mercury, and so on through the zodiac. Again, this is kind of basic foundational astrological information. If you already know it, great. If not, here's a list. And you don't have to write it all down, because first of all, this information is easily found anywhere by an internet search. And also I'm going to be repeating it as we go throughout the presentation. So now I'm going to go through each of the planets one by one to discuss what they mean in the body. But first of all, are there any questions? Am I going too fast or anything like that?
You're making perfect sense to me. I kind of think, just looking at the names of here, that most of the people here have some astrology background. But if anyone isn't, and you don't know what ruler means, or something isn't making sense, by all means speak up.
Okay, great. So again, each of these planets rules what I'm calling a system in the body that's connected symbolically and energetically. Okay, we're going to go from slowest to fastest. So we're going to start with Saturn as our slowest planet, and here we go. So if you have Capricorn or Aquarius on the cusp of your sixth house, then your house of illness is ruled by Saturn. So Saturn has to do spiritually and abstractly with boundaries, structure, and retention. So these energies in your body may be on the weaker side, and you need to take care to build them and guard them. In the body, Saturn traditionally rules the lymph, the spleen, and the immune system. And these all relate to the concept of boundaries. The immune system sets a boundary between what is self and what is not self, right? Its job is to contain and attack what it thinks is not self and protect what it thinks is the self. Saturn also traditionally rules the skin and the tendons. And again, that relates to the idea of boundaries. Your skin is literally the boundary of your body, right? Saturn also rules the bones and the teeth, and this relates to structure. It gives your body this sense of structure and support. Saturn also rules the ears, and cognitively, Saturn rules the memory. And these relate to the concept of retention, taking things in and holding them. Okay, as far as lifestyle, so if you have Saturn ruling the sixth, it's possible that illness can come about from too much responsibility. Saturn is a very hard worker. Saturnian people tend to bear the weight of the world on their shoulders. So if Saturn rules the sixth, this can lead to possible illness related to the stress of too much responsibility. So you want to be careful. You need to strengthen your ability to set boundaries. Don't overwork yourself. Learn to say no. Learn to take breaks. Learn to relax, okay? Because it's literally vital for your health. An herb related to Saturn, again, there's lots of them, lots of herbs to pick. I just picked one for each planet that I know I'm familiar with and I love. This one is mullein. An example of why mullein is ruled by Saturn. And we have literature going back hundreds of years that says, you know, this plant is ruled by this planet. And I think it was, I'd have to remember, I'm pretty sure it was Culpeper who said that mullein is ruled by Saturn. And there's lots of reasons why we would give a planet rulership or an herb rulership to a certain planet, because we're looking at symbolic energy. One thing, if you see a mullein plant, if you've ever seen them growing, they grow straight up, real tall, real just like proud and like real strong and sturdy. And the mullein plant does that in your body. It gives you good posture because it's tightening and tonifying the ligaments and the tendons in your body. So it can help you kind of stand up tall, can literally give you a better backbone, right? Which is about, you know, when people say you need a backbone, they're talking about setting boundaries and being strong. And it supports that Saturnian energy physically, as well as energetically. So this is just an example, and I could just talk all day about all of these plants and how they tie in with the symbolism of the planets, but that's just one example. So that's a teaser. I'm going to move on to Jupiter, but before I do, are there any questions about Saturn?
I have a question about really like the herbs you're talking about here. Would those be like something you'd recommend as a tea, a capsule, a tonic? It depends on the herb. Like, is there one method that's better than another?
It does depend on the herb and what you're working with. You know what? Let's see. I think every herb that I have in this every herb I have in this presentation is generally recognized as safe. And unless you're allergic to it, it can't cause any problems. My preferred method for most herbs is a tea, but you can make a tincture. And it just kind of depends what you're going for, what you're looking for. Capsules are fine, but usually you have to take more capsules because they're not absorbed as well, because they when you make it in a tea, the constituents are going to be extracted into the water before you drink it, so it's easier to absorb, whereas a capsule, your body kind of has to do that extra work, so you need more of the herb. But it's kind of complex. I would say all of these plants that I'm offering are what we call nutritive, meaning that they have lots of vitamins and minerals, and they're just good for general health. And so you can just make them as a tea, drink them every day. It's not going to hurt you, and it's going to be kind of a way to just like connect spiritually with that energy, right? So I would say tea is a really solid place to start. If you can't handle the taste, then explore other options. that clear as mud?
No, that was very clear. Thank you.
Okay. All right, Jupiter. Jupiter is the largest planet and it rules the largest organs in the body, starting with the liver, which is our largest organ by weight. Jupiter is also a gas giant, right? And Jupiter also rules the lungs, which are the gas giants of our body, right? Because they take in the air. Jupiter's connection to philosophy brings this idea of filtering what's true and false, what's right and wrong, and so on. And in the body, the liver and the lungs both filter. They're related to this idea. So the liver filters our blood and the lungs filter the air. And we also have this connection to the theme of transformation. The liver, for example, transforms our hormones from one form to another so they can go on to the next stage of what they're supposed to do. Jupiter also traditionally rules the blood. And that's because the ancients believed that the blood was actually created and generated in the liver. But it's so Jupiter rules blood, but not the blood that like comes out of you when you're wounded. That's more of a Mars thing. The blood related to Jupiter is more about the quality of the blood in your body. So if Jupiter rules your sixth house, the ancients believed you might be more disposed to, quote, corruption of the blood. So this would mean something like the liver is having a harder time filtering toxins or whatever out of it. And so your blood might get sludgy and carry bad humors around and so on. And Jupiter, I forgot to mention the signs. So if you're looking at Sagittarius or Pisces, those are the signs ruled by Jupiter traditionally. And so then your sixth house would be ruled by Jupiter. Now, the traditional literature doesn't always explicitly address the cognitive side. There are a lot of hints, but they use different language for it. So I'm interpreting in modern language what I'm kind of taking from the tradition and extrapolating and putting it in modern terminology. So, you know, executive function, it's kind of more of a relatively recent term. We don't have that in, 200 years ago. They weren't talking about executive function. But I think Jupiter rules executive function because here's my logic for it. A lot of literature talks about Jupiter ruling diseases that involve fainting or apoplexy. And apoplexy just means losing consciousness or losing the ability to think properly. So to me, that says that Jupiter is ruling the cognitive process when you're conscious, when you know what you're thinking, and the ability to control your conscious thoughts and behavior. So this is executive function is about being able to make decisions, like filter stuff that doesn't matter and prioritize what does matter, making plans, conscious decisions of what we're going to do with our lives, right? And then, of course, Jupiter also rules a positive mood. Jupiter is the Santa Claus of the sky. Ho, ho, ho. He's very optimistic, right? So people with Jupiter ruling the sixth house might have more weaknesses in this system. These are all connected spiritually. So as a lifestyle option or a lifestyle focus, alcohol tends to be pretty not great for people with sixth house Jupiter, because alcohol is bad for your liver, and your liver is already one of your weak areas, right? Alcohol also reduces your inhibitions and weakens your executive function, which is the opposite of what you want when that system is already vulnerable. So lay off the heavy partying, try not to drink so much. You really want to cut that down. Also avoid smoking since Jupiter rules the lungs. But I would tell that to anybody, no matter what, because let's not smoke. All right. An herb to support Jupiter is dandelion. This is excellent for the liver. It's rich in so many nutrients. It's just this wonderful plant. It has a mood boosting effect. And there's just so many things. I'm really tempted to go down the rabbit hole of the herbs, but I'm going to not say too much. I will say you've heard of roasted dandelion root as a coffee replacement, probably. In my opinion, it's not a coffee replacement. Nothing replaces coffee, but it does taste good. However, the roasted roots, it removes a lot of the kind of nutrition quality. So you're not going to get as much of the benefits out of it. So you want to go with the dried roots that are not roasted. and the dried leaf. So I would actually make a blend with 1/3 roasted root, 1/3 regular dried root, and 1/3 of the leaves. You can even throw in some dried flowers if you have them. And make a tea out of that. So the roasted root will make it taste better because honestly, dandelion's pretty bitter. It'll kind of give a better flavor profile to it, and then add some honey, add some other flavor to sort of cover up the bitter. But yeah. Okay, so any questions about Jupiter before I move on?
Caleb has a question. He said, if the quality of blood belongs to Jupiter, would Raynaud's syndrome possibly be a Jupiterian syndrome as it relates to small seizures in the capillaries that halt blood flow?
I'm not familiar with Raynaud's. Is that a
It's where people, have like cold fingers and toes because their blood circulation isn't getting into their extremities very well.
okay, yeah, I have heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the tricky thing. The names of diseases are just labels. And the causes are going to be different from person to person. So two people can be given the same diagnosis, but the pathway for how they got there might be different. And there might be different energetic systems being activated spiritually or energetically with the astrology. So I'm really hesitant to say that any one disease belongs to any one planet. Because often the disease is actually the end product of something much more upstream. And I will talk about this later using an example from my own life. So if I could kind of pause that question until I get to that part of the presentation. But to address like immediately, I would be real careful with that because there's a lot that goes into, especially a chronic illness like that. There's going to be multiple things being activated, but possibly, especially if the liver is involved somehow, but possibly. Okay, so the next planet is Mars. If you have Aries or Scorpio on your 6th house, that means it's ruled by Mars. And the symbolism for Mars relates to heat, passion, energy, antagonism, and movement. So in the body, Mars rules the adrenals, and this pulls on the idea of movement, right? Adrenaline gets you going when you got to get going. Mars also rules the gallbladder. Now, this is interesting. We might not immediately think of that in today's mentality, but here's how the ancients got there. Digestion, according to traditional thinking, was a fiery process. They talk about digestive fire. You need to create heat in order to break the food down. And they knew that the gallbladder created a liquid that helped with digestion. And so they gave the gallbladder to Mars because it generates digestive fire, right? Okay, so that's why it's connected to Mars. Now it's interesting because this carries into today's thought in different ways, because the ancients also believed that the gallbladder produced courage because of the association with Mars. So you've heard people say something like, I can't believe the gall of that person, right? Well, it's talking about the liquid produced by the gallbladder ruled by Mars, and they believed that it caused people to act courageously, but usually in a kind of shocking or antisocial way or unacceptable way somehow. It's like a Mars-like behavior, right? So that's how Mars gets associated with the gallbladder. Mars also traditionally rules the organs of excrement, and this is related to the idea of antagonism, the things that we reject from our bodies. Mars also rules the muscles. Mars is about physical movement, right? And so the muscles are an obvious connection there. And then on the cognitive side of things, Mars is about willpower and courage. So if you have Mars ruling the 6th, any of these systems might be more vulnerable for you. You need to be careful about protecting them. As a lifestyle thing, You want to be careful with injuries. Be careful with over exercising. There is such a thing as too much exercise. It can lead to illness. You also want to be careful not to put yourself in a situation where you could have accidents or injuries that for unnecessary, like don't take unnecessary risks in that way. Also do what you can to avoid getting into fights. It's not your strong suit. Don't don't get into physical altercations. Again, this is advice I'd probably give anybody, like let's maybe not do a bunch of physical fighting, but especially if you have Mars on the 6th. An herb related to Mars is ginger. It's delicious in food as well as in tea. They make it in capsules as well. You might have heard about ginger being helpful against nausea. It's actually wonderful for that. I actually like ginger in my coffee. I get like a tube of paste they have at the grocery store where it's like pre-ground up and you just squeeze it in the coffee. I tried it because someone mentioned it and I didn't expect to like it, but the flavors actually go together really well. It's delightful. And now I want ginger every single day in my coffee. Ginger stimulates circulation in your body while at the same time relaxing your nerves. It's a paradox, kind of like how it's stimulating and relaxing at the same time. It's also excellent for digestion. We talked about the nausea. It's antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory. It's just a wonderful friend. So Mars and ginger, check it out. Any questions about Mars? Okay, the next planet in our order of speed here, slowest to fastest, is the sun. If you have Leo on the cusp of the 6th, the sun rules the house of illness. The sun is related to the concepts of expressiveness, the core self. Sometimes people call this the ego. That word can get kind of thrown around and sort of misunderstood or misapplied or what. It's got some baggage to it, right? So I kind of like the term core self better. Who you are at the center of your being, right? And then perspective. So the sun is the center of the solar system and it looks out on all the other planets and it's got this wide view of everybody, right? So in the body, the sun rules the heart and by extension, the cardiovascular system. It makes total sense, right? Because the heart is a pretty important organ, right? Like it's the center of your being. If you don't have a heartbeat, you're literally dead. So it's pretty important, right? So this relates to the idea of the core self. Even symbolically, we talk about like put your heart into it, or my heart belongs to whatever. We think of like identifying ourselves with our heart, and also expressing ourselves with our heart. The sun co-rules the eyes with the moon. So sun and the moon together rule the eyes. And this brings in the idea of perspective and how you see the world. Now, the next part is my opinion because the ancients didn't know about vitamin D, but I believe that the sun does rule vitamin D and the ability of the body to produce it. I actually just wrote an article about this topic and it's going to be released pretty soon in Denise's magazine. Well, it's not your personal magazine, but you're involved in it, the OPA magazine. So I hope that you all can check that out later. There's a lot of really amazing symbolic connections between the astrological sun and vitamin D in the body. So not to toot my own horn, but I'm kind of excited about that. Cognitively, the sun governs our ability to make meaning from our lives. It's a really important psychological process to be able to understand our lives as a story. This is a solar type of activity because the sun provides that perspective. The sun is also traditionally associated with rational thought with an external focus. So just like the sun's rays shine outward, our thoughts that reach outward in a rational way are ruled by the sun. So the sun is your 6th house ruler. These systems might be tricky or difficult for you. You want to get your vitamin D levels checked, make sure they're up to where they need to be. Lifestyle wise, be careful with sunburns, literal sunburns, and any kind of radiation. Maybe provide a little extra caution in that area. An herb related to the sun, traditionally ruled by the sun, is hawthorn. And this is a delightful herb. It's traditionally associated with the heart. It also does a lot of other wonderful things in the body. Safe to take even if you are on heart medication. Obviously check with your doctor, but in most cases it's fine. And it's delicious. The berries are kind of a sweet flavor. I actually like mixing 1/3 berries, 1/3 leaves, and 1/3 flowers, dried flowers. It's kind of a nice blend there with hawthorn. Any questions about the sun? I'm already at 45 minutes. Ah!
No questions in the chat box. Christine said this was so interesting. She didn't want to leave, but she told us she had to leave at 3:45, and she did. And that
Okay,
she said thank you so much, and she looks forward to watching the rest of this.
great. Yeah, no problem. Life happens. We gotta, it's no worries. All right, the next planet is Venus. And the spiritual concepts of Venus are about balance, sociability, and desire. Venus rules Taurus and Libra. So if you have those on your 6th house, this applies to you. Venus is considered to be a cool and moist planet. She doesn't get heated up. That's Mars. Mars gets all heated up and passionate. Venus cools things down. She comes at, cool and moist, and let's keep things flowing here. And in the body, Venus rules the kidneys, which are all about balance of fluid in the body, right? The kidneys literally help everything stay balanced so you don't get too much fluid or too little fluid. Venus also rules the neck, and so by extension, the organs in the neck, for example, the thyroid. And the thyroid is also about the balance of hormones in the body. Too much, too little is kind of keeping track of the hormones. Venus rules the nose and the pancreas. And again, we have this concept of balance because pancreas is about balancing blood sugar. And Venusian people, kind of a stereotype is that they love their sugar, right? One of my sons is a Taurus moon, and oh my goodness, he's got a sweet tooth. This kid is so cute. He's always like, hey, do we have any chocolate? But watch that pancreas. Don't stress out the insulin there. Cut back on the sugar a little bit. You don't want to stress out the pancreas. Venus rules the reproductive organs, and this is related to, fertility. And this is the idea of sociability. Let's create more people so that we have a society to live in, right? And then cognitively, Venus rules the part of our psyches that relates to desire. So people with Venus ruling the 6th house really need to be careful about addictive substances. Venus rules poison as well as the desire element of the mind. And so this can become corrupted and pull you into addiction. So if you know that this is an area of weakness for you, I would just say avoid anything that's known to be addictive. Don't even try it once, right? Just stay away, steer clear. Also, I've got 2 lifestyle things for Venus. Practice safe sex. Again, this is everybody, but you've heard of the term venereal disease. That actually comes from the word Venus. It's about, sexual desire and then the disease that can come from that, so watch out for that problem. An herb related to Venus is yarrow, Achillea millefolium. That's fun to say. Pretty flowers. Yarrow is in the herbalist world, we call it a polycrest herb, which means it does all the things. It's amazing. It does so many things. It's just excellent for your health in so many ways. I mean, you name it. It's good for the kidneys. Yes. It's good for the hormones. Yes. It's good for blood sugar. Yes. It's good for immune. Yeah. It's a wonderful herb. Lily and Culpepper gave it to Venus, and I would recommend checking it out. Now, yarrow is bitter. That is a downside, which is kind of strange because you would think something ruled by Venus would taste good, but go figure. It's related to Venus. So mix in some cinnamon or peppermint or flavors that you like. You'll be able to get it down. Okay, any questions on Venus? All right, I'm going to move to Mercury. So Mercury is the messenger, right? Mercury also rules the processing, this concept of we need to process stuff. And then a word for Mercury it's kind of an awkward word, splitting, but think of Gemini, right? Gemini is ruled by Mercury, and it's symbolized by twins. So we have two split off, right? Split off, but they're unified as well. Dividing and splitting things is an important part of analyzing and processing whatever it is. So in the body, Mercury rules the shoulders and the arms, which of course, split off from the core of the body, right? And the hands. So you have the arm and then it splits off into fingers. This is kind of a mercurial energy here. Mercury also rules the brain and the central nervous system. And if you think of the shape of a nerve, I think it's really cool that it resembles the shape of a hand. And it could be total coincidence, but I just think it's neat that the Mercury rules both, and the Mercury energy connects things that seem kind of otherwise related. Mercury rules the tongue and the speech. And so that's, about communication and messaging and all that stuff. Mercury also rules the small intestines. And so this leads to the idea of processing our food, right? It's breaking it down, it's sending it out to the body, it's processing where it goes and all of that kind of stuff. And then cognitively, Mercury is about our ability to focus. Mercury is the scholar, the student, the studious researcher, the accountant, the bean counter, right? It's getting in the weeds and all the details. So for sixth house Mercury people, these areas might be vulnerable for you. You want to watch out. Lifestyle wise, illness might have a doorway through perfectionism, getting so obsessed about the details. As an example, I used to be a pianist, and some of my peers sometimes would get carpal tunnel. And this can happen when you practice too much without breaks and you're too tightly focused on what you're doing and trying so hard to be perfect, and it ends up kind of creating an injury or an illness in the body. That's just one example of Mercury related illness. So watch out for the hyper focus. Try to get out of your head sometimes, right? Yes, hyper focus is great, but also have a balance. Learn to look at the bigger picture. Live a little. Have some fun. An herb related to ruled by Mercury is lavender. It's a beautiful, lovely herb. Again, it does a lot of things. It can help support digestion. It boosts your mood. It helps with the nervous system. It's amazing. One of my favorite herbs, one of my favorite plants. But yeah, so any questions on Mercury? Okay, so I'm going to move on to the moon, the fastest moving planet, the last on our list. The moon is about sensitivity, reflection, and nurture. So if you think about the moon takes in the light of the sun, right? And then reflects it back out. So she's very receptive, very sensitive, and then she cares about everyone and everything. She's kind of taking in and giving out. So the moon rules the stomach, which is a very receptive organ. It receives our food, and it starts that whole process of reflecting the virtues of your food out to the rest of the body. The stomach is where this idea of you are what you eat, that's the moon is telling us that, right? It's the virtues of your food are taken into the stomach, and then it gets passed on to the rest of the body. Just like the moon reflects light onto the earth. And I just think it's another kind of interesting coincidence that the stomach is crescent shaped, kind of like the moon. I don't know, do with that what you will. The moon also rules the breasts, and that's the nurture element. She co-rules the eyes with the sun and the endocrine system. And this is interesting because the moon is also a messenger. Mercury's a messenger. The moon is also a messenger. But we usually think of Mercury as the messages in the body that are more, that we're more aware of. So like the central nervous system is, we're kind of in control of like the movements that we make. But the endocrine system happens, we're not aware of our hormones kind of going on in the background until we get some kind of symptom related to them, right? So the hormones are going along, they're telling everything in our body, this is what you do now, this is what you do now, this is what you do now. Without us knowing about it, right? So the moon is kind of intuitive. It's below the surface. It's happening at a different level. The moon also rules the autonomic nervous system and the emotions, which live in the autonomic nervous system. It's the same kind of idea. These messages are happening behind the scenes. So as far as lifestyle, people with the moon ruling the sixth house, so this would be Cancer, the sign of Cancer, need to be careful about giving themselves an emotional outlet. Illness for you can come about through stuffing your emotions. And for people with sixth house moons, this cannot, it might not come easy to you. You might be just more used to kind of keeping them. You're not even in touch with your emotions. But emotions are like water. They need to flow. If they get stuck, they stagnate, they cause all kinds of problems. So you want to make sure to learn to better connect with your emotions. Make some time for doing art or music or writing in a journal or go to therapy or doing some kind of activity that allows your emotions to move through you. An herb ruled by the moon is mallow. Some people call it marshmallow. You've heard of marshmallows, but this does not mean that the candy marshmallow is good for you because it's not. It doesn't even have this herb in it. They used to make it with the herb, and that's where the candy gets its name from, but now it's just corn syrup. Nah. But the plant, the plant is a weed that grows all over the world. It's pretty much everywhere. You might have it in your backyard right now. But it's amazing. It's moisturizing, it's antimicrobial, it's excellent for the stomach. It helps kind of coat the lining of the stomach. Usually at an herb store, they sell this as the root, and you can get the dried root. And this is the only one that I would say you don't make it in a hot tea. It actually extracts best in cold water. So put it in a jar with some cold water, put it in your fridge overnight, and in the morning, it'll have extracted in the water. Just the mucilage that's in the plant comes out better in cold water. Okay. So before I move on, are there any questions about the moon? All right. So the last kind of big point that I want to make is about the systemic connections. So I mentioned we have these energetic systems related to the physical body for each planet. Another reason why this is helpful to know is if you ever face a mystery disease, the type, you go to the doctor, they can't figure out what's wrong with you, or they give you a diagnosis but they don't know how to treat it, or they don't know they don't know what causes it, or one of these mystery kinds of conditions. I would recommend the first thing to look at in your body is the sixth house, but understand that the body is very complex. You can get a symptom and there are a lot of complicated things behind it, and like up the chain, it eventually ends up being the sixth house, even though the symptom doesn't seem obviously related. So I'll give you an example from my own life. Several years ago, I started getting terrible migraines. I mean, just awful. And I hadn't had migraines before, but I suddenly started getting them like 2 weeks out of every month. And migraines are one of these mystery diseases, as I learned, because I went to the best neurologist in Phoenix and he couldn't help me. The medication made it worse. Nothing was helping. And doctors don't know what causes them. They're extremely common, but for some reason, the scientific research is not as robust as for other conditions. Now, like I said earlier, there's not just one thing that causes any disease. Everyone's body is different, and different people can be diagnosed with the same thing, but have totally different pathways or causes for it. So as I said, the medications weren't helping, and I was trying all kinds of different things. And what ended up working was treating my liver. I started taking milk thistle, which targets the liver and helps purify it. And I did, some dietary changes and lifestyle changes, and it was like magic. Within 30 minutes of taking the milk thistle, my migraine lifted. And it was like, oh my goodness. And that kind of set me on the path. And I didn't know medical astrology at the time. I knew like parts of it, but I hadn't really gone super in depth. So I was sort of shooting in the dark, but later on, I figured out what was going on, because in my chart, my sixth house ruler is Jupiter, which rules the liver. And the theory behind some migraines, not all of them, because again, different people, different pathways, different things, but some people, the liver has trouble keeping up with processing the hormones. So some of the hormones get recirculated back into the blood in a half processed state. I'm using real simplified, doctors would roll their eyes at me, but use a real simplified language. So the hormones are being recycled back into the blood instead of broken down. And estrogen in particular, in its half broken down format, ends up becoming neuroinflammatory. So it causes neurological pain, which ends up leading to migraine. So you see the progression, like we're far, like you wouldn't think migraine, liver, what's even the connection? But in my case, my liver is a weaker system, and it was having trouble keeping up. So it ended up with hormonal problems, which lead to neurological problems, which lead to the migraine. And it's in my astrological chart. And if I had known at the time, I would have started there. But I had to kind of take a long path because I hadn't been studying it then. But anyway, so again, no one size fits all. We cannot diagnose diseases through astrology, but we can look at systems and we can say, okay, this is a system that tends to be weaker for you. So maybe try strengthening that system and see what happens, downstream, right? So, and I've seen some pretty great results taking that approach. All right, so that is my presentation. Are there any questions or ideas or anything?
I felt like this was such a wonderful introduction to medical astrology. It was really easy to follow and understand, Abigail.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. Caleb, Liz, do either of you have questions or comments or wanna?
I had no background at all in medical astrology besides knowing it existed. So I just want to reiterate what Denise said, that it was a really good intro to it, and like knowing exactly what the field entails. I was familiar with like the zodiac man idea, right? That like different signs or planets like could be governed, or different parts of the body could be governed by signs and planets, but not necessarily what they were. And this was like a much deeper dive, so I really dug it, and it was very well said. Thank you, Abigail.
My pleasure. Yeah, there's some drawings that Zodiac man out there. It looks really weird. He's like contorted around a circle. I think it's really funny. I like those drawings.
Yeah, thank you. I have no exposure to this part of my chart, so this was awesome to see and to hear about.
Good.
I'm sure all of us, like me, were probably the most tuned into, what our own was. And it was interesting because, when we took the horary class, we had just a little bit of medical astrology, like we talked about the topic, but I hadn't ever really given it a whole lot of thought. And as an astrologer, I find that I really draw people to me who are going through heavy Neptune transits, which I know isn't traditional astrology, but it really does seem to be correlated to like physical or mental like changes, issues. And in fact, I was thinking the other day about when I was a teenager, when I was like 16, I had mononucleosis for quite a long time. And it's supposed to, you have it once and then you never have it again. But then it recurred for me like a year later or a year and a half later in college. And so I don't know, it's one of those things where I woke up in the morning and thought, you know what? I wonder if that's when Neptune was on my moon. And so I went back and sure enough, it was like I could see when Neptune had hit my moon like 3 times in a row because of a retrograde is when I had like the heavy episode of mononucleosis. And then it went forward and came back within a 2 or 3 degree orb. And that's when I had the recurrence. And I thought, wow. Wow.
That's crazy. And doesn't the moon rule your 6th house?
No, my 6th house is Gemini, so it's Mercury ruled. But I suspect it had to do with anxiety and exhaustion. because even as a teenager, I overdid things all the time and was a major perfectionist, right? And so I just literally like wore myself out.
Yeah. Well, and the moon rules the body generally, because the moon is very universal. Like the moon is everything, right? So transits to the moon are going to be felt no matter what. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was just interesting. My own little like, oh my, it's like funny how sometimes I'm sure you guys have the same thing where you like wake up in the morning and you're like, oh, I need to go look at that. You know, it's like light bulbs went off somehow while you were sleeping about some particular part of your life
Yeah.
that had to do with astrology. So anyone else have anything they'd like to share? I'm going to go ahead and stop the record.